So my name is Kathy Bergren Smith, and I came upon the story of the Marvel several years back, and I ultimately pulled a lot of research threads trying to find out more about the story. And I will say that there is no greater gift to a researcher than a person that is an eyewitness to an event. And that is John Ferguson, who is with us today. He was on board the Marvel with his father. He was a rising senior at Bloomfield, New Jersey High School. And he and his dad went on a trip that he was having so much fun on, he asked his dad to allow him to stay another week. And so things were going very well with John. And not only was John a great resource as an eyewitness for his recollections, he is the best kind of resource because even at his age of 16, he was an amazing archivist. John kept a diary on the trip, and then he collected an awful lot of memorabilia and news clippings and remained in correspondence with other survivors. So it's really his foresight as such a young person to collect and maintain his archive that has given us a lot of the documentation that I was able to draw from. And so I have to say, John, we owe, all of us that are interested in the Marvel, owe a huge debt of gratitude to you. As I said, he was only 16, he lost his dad in the tragedy, but even so, in all of these years passing by, he has maintained his love of the sea and boating, and he spent his entire career in various elements of the travel industry, including cruise ships. So when you would think about somebody going through such a life-changing trauma, he defies that. So we'll have to talk to him a little about that in a minute. Also with us today is Maggie Roberts Barkin. She was 2 years old once, our little Maggie over here, and her parents were Dr. Bert Roberts, who was he was an up-and-coming researcher at just the age, in his very early 30s, at Yale University. And he was beginning some of the very seminal research in social psychology and psychiatry. He was a psychiatrist himself and a researcher at Yale. And he and his wife, Frances, went on their very first vacation, leaving Maggie and her little sister, Maggie at 2 and her sister at 7 months, Priscilla, behind for the very first time since their honeymoon. Bert didn't make it home, and Maggie's mom had to raise those girls on her own. And our Maggie spent her career after growing up with her single mom, who herself made an amazing career in the state of Connecticut as a child care specialist and working on various statewide commissions to assist other women, probably because of her sense of empathy as a single mother. She assisted in developing some of Connecticut's and the nation's child care protocols, which is pretty interesting. And Maggie grew up obviously successfully with her mom at the helm, and she spent her career mainly in theater and in the classroom. So we are looking forward to talking to her about her mother's recollections of the trip, and also looking forward to any sort of theatrical developments that she may have for the story. So I'd like to start with John and ask him about an introduction to the Victory Chimes. Like, how did you and your dad find out about it? How did you get on the ship?
Well, as Kathy said, I'm a lover of boats and ships and the sea and all of that, and I have been all of my life. And I saw an ad in the New York Times for a schooner cruise, the Dude Schooners up in Maine, the Victory Chimes. And I read it, and it sounded very exciting. So I sent away, you used to do things like that in those days, you sent away for things, for a brochure, and subsequently booked the trip for myself and my father a little bit in advance. And then I happened to come across another ad for the Levin J Marvel in the Chesapeake. And it was very similar, but it was Washington. I thought, wow, we can go to Washington and then go over to Annapolis and go on this schooner. So I canceled one and rebooked the other, and that's how we got there.
And then Maggie, now we rely on Maggie as we would call her a secondary source, because her mom, she had, if you'll recall, all the years she had with her mom, who told her stories and over. So how did your parents get to the ship?
Well, they really, it was a choice to change their plans in August for their summer vacation. They had intended to go to Cape Cod with a number of their friends and colleagues from Yale for a week's vacation, but there was an outbreak of polio in Boston. And my father was concerned that they might get exposed to polio if people from Boston were coming out to the Cape. So he said, let's find something else to do. And they saw an ad in the New York Times for this trip. And it wasn't something they'd ever really considered, but they'd both had some boating experience on lakes as summer campers and counselors. So they said, well, look, let's drive, let's book it, we'll put a deposit down, we'll drive down, and just see if this is what we want to do. Let's check it out.
So both your parents and John had seen marketing material from the Levin J Marvel that was actually from Herman Nust's operation of the Marvel, which was, if you'll recall, Nust started this project just after World War II. And in the late 1940s, and he ran a very successful business until he decided to sell the Victory Chimes, went up to Maine, as we know, right away, and this was in 1953, but the Marvel didn't have a buyer until John Meckling came along. So it had been essentially mothballed for almost 18 months when Meckling purchased the vessel, but he used the same marketing materials and sent those brochures that John sent for, depicted a very different state of the vessel, to say kindly, than what they encountered when they arrived in Annapolis. John, what was your impression when you got to town?
Well, it didn't look like the pictures, that's for sure. The boat was, I don't know, I'll call it a boat, but the vessel was painted with what I thought was some kind of aluminum paint. So it was all a dingy, silvery hull. And on board, it just was tired looking, but it was exciting. And you overlooked a lot of the things, I think, because of that.
Uh-huh. And there was, I will say, the prior season, there was a fellow, so when you booked a vacation on the Levin J Marvel, you were invited to spend Sunday night aboard in Annapolis, down at the end of City Dock, and then you would set sail on Monday morning. There was a retired Army guy from World War II who had made a booking in '54, the season prior to the sinking, and brought his family from New York on Sunday and decided that the ship was in such poor shape they wouldn't stay. And he followed up by writing letters to Coast Guard, which came up later in the trial. So people encountered a very different vessel than they saw advertised, and they traveled down. In the case of your parents, Maggie, they had traveled from New Haven, Connecticut, so they were fairly committed, but they had their doubts.
They had made a plan ahead of time that they would find a reason to get off on their own and have a conversation. So after they met a number of the people who were traveling, they said they'd go to the market and pick up some things. And when they went to the market, they said, well, what do you think? And my father was very excited about Lewis and Minna Sobel, who also traveled. Lewis Sobel had been responsible for an organization that rescued hundreds and hundreds of Jewish children from Europe and resettled them in the United States. And my parents are Jewish, and they were both so impressed with the Sobels that he said, well, if Louis Sobel thinks it's okay, we'll be fine. So they decided to go.
Now, on a side note, one time I gave a talk about this, and a person came up after, and he said, I was 6 years old in 1955, but my father worked at Fawcett's down on City Dock, and I often went down there. And he said, and the men, every time that Levin J Marvel sailed out, they'd stand there and click their tongues and say, boy, those suckers going out on that old wreck. But it wasn't, and the people that were on board were having a really good time. So that's what I kind of want to get from you, John, is if you could kind of tell us what it was like that made the vacation on the Marvel so much fun. And I know that John Meckling himself was a real raconteur, and he was a do-it-yourselfer, and he, to his credit, yes, the ship went down, but he was a good sailor. And that summer, he had a couple of very good deckhands with him. And so they were able to sail a lot. And would you say it was the people or the sailing adventure that you liked the best?
Well, first, the captain who you mentioned, he was very charismatic. There's no question about that. He was a tall, good-looking guy, and he just gave you the feeling that this is going to be a great experience, and let's all be ready to enjoy ourselves and do everything we can to have a really good time. But he was a little bit of a dreamer too, I think, and he didn't take the big picture, in my opinion, as to what he was doing. But as far as the people were concerned, it was a very, very interesting group of people. As Maggie said, there were some real heavyweights there, and there were other younger people that were just out for a sort of adventure. There were a lot of single ladies and gentlemen that didn't know each other. Everybody mixed in. I was kind of a sort of an in-between person. I wasn't a kid. There were two little children, Hillary and Hillard. They were children. I wasn't a child. And then there were all the adults. So it was a great, diverse, interesting group of people, but mostly everybody was there to really do everything they could to make it enjoyable for themselves and their companions.
And so when you set forth, you went out the first day, you sailed out of Annapolis, and you went out behind Poplar Island and anchored.
Well, before that, there's one little thing that was very interesting. We organized a safari to the liquor store. And there was quite a group of people, and some people bought bottles of wine, some people bought 6 packs of beer, and I think there was one lady who bought herself a nice bottle of vodka, and everybody trooped over there. I think that liquor store is still there. Trooped over there and made their purchases and came back. So that kind of gave you the idea that everybody was extremely congenial. Now back to Poplar Island, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so you went over and you spent the night behind Poplar Island at anchor. And I guess that was probably the ice-breaking dinner aboard?
Yeah, the dining room or dining salon or whatever you want to call it was all the way forward, and there were, I think, 2 large tables with banquettes, and everyone could be accommodated there. And it just was really very, very pleasant. The food was very good, and plentiful and served nicely, and people just mixed around. The couples that were there, of course, sat together, but other people just sat wherever they were, and everybody just conversed and enjoyed it.
And then in the evening, after you had your supper, would people go back up on deck and talk? And
Yeah.
one thing I was thinking about was if you were a single person back in 1955, particularly a woman, these were young gals that, had jobs and they were independent. It would have been difficult for them to probably find a place to go on a vacation, and the Marvel provided sort of instant camaraderie. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
There was a group of, I don't know what, 3 or 4 ladies, and there were about the same number of gentlemen that were on their own, and they kind of mixed in. There were nothing unusual or untoward or anything like that, but they did sort of gravitate together.
Mm-hmm.
So you had the couples and the family with the 2 little children, and it was all just a very nice mixture.
And so you went from Poplar the following day over to Oxford, and everyone left Oxford on the ship, and you went up to the Robert Morris Inn.
Right.
And did pretty much everybody go? So like Maggie's parents were probably there? And
I believe almost everybody did, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And as Diane said, the television was there, was still somewhat of a novelty. And there was a bar, and it was very, very nice.
So I guess, now we're on Tuesday night. The tragedy occurred on Friday, just to put it into perspective here. Were you aware of the hurricane? Was that a topic of conversation?
There was, it began, I don't know exactly when it began, but there was talk that gradually did build up and spread around. It wasn't, I don't think anybody was upset by it, but it was there. Mm-hmm. But no one kind of, I wouldn't say didn't take it seriously, but people just didn't want to think about things like that, I think.
And they were on a vacation, and you were very close to land all the time. You could always see shore.
Yes.
So the following morning, which is now Wednesday, you took the ferry over to Bellevue.
We took, I don't know how many people, I think a couple of different groups went at different times, but we took the ferry from Oxford to Bellevue and walked around there. I bought a boat in a bottle. It was a really nice one. It was about that big. And I had said to, doctor to look for it if she sends someone down there again. But no, it was a very nice day, and we enjoyed that.
And so the master, John Meckling, on Wednesday, he must have been, having his doubts and hedging his bets a bit, because he took the ship up to Cambridge, where he would have had, so Oxford has a town dock. At that time, it was pretty much like it is today, and probably even less substantial. And if you have a ship the size of the Marvel had some cables that it could also use to secure it. So by moving to Cambridge, he was able to use the industrial dock there on the waterfront he could have secured the vessel in the event of hurricane force winds. He's further up river in the chop tank. He's a little more protected, and he can tie off more. So I loved the fact that he kind of sells this to the New Yorkers by saying, oh, you're going to love Cambridge. You're going to be able to go to the movies. It's very cosmopolitan. Cambridge doesn't seem like a very cosmopolitan place. And in 1955, I can't imagine that it was. But then you slept overnight on Wednesday in Cambridge and Thursday. Take us through what that day was like when you woke up.
It was all right. Again, the people were hearing more and more ashore too about this potential storm, but it didn't seem to upset anybody, and they were looking forward to going swimming. He was going to take the Marvel out and anchor and let people swim off the boat, and that was very appealing to everyone.
And the weather hadn't been great that week, right?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't brochure weather, that's for sure. But it was all right.
But this was like the first super nice day.
This was when it began to get questionable, and when this whole story of the hurricane flags originated. So
you listened to the noon weather, and everyone aboard was very happy to hear that the hurricane warning flags had been lowered for the area that you were in and replaced by a storm warning. But that wasn't of too much concern because the Marvel, being so heavy and having such great sails, really needed a lot of wind to move her along at any kind of clip. Remember now, she had no engine to assist, just the yawl boat, which she wasn't supposed to be using because she would then be operating as a motorboat and subject to Coast Guard scrutiny and inspection. So even though you weren't supposed to use the yawl boat, you've noticed using the yawl boat.
the yawl boat was indeed used to move the ship at different times, yes.
So you set off down the chop tank in the afternoon on Thursday with the intention of getting back to Annapolis, sort of a weather window, if you will, right?
Yes.
Probably with the yawl boat pushing you because the wind just died off to nothing, didn't it?
Yes, yes.
So they went all evening, and then they get down by Oxford, and, you know, remembering the number of young people aboard and the fact that they're all on vacation, there was a little bit of a mutiny.
And they decided to send the yawl boat ashore to replenish the supplies. So that I don't recall exactly who all was in the yawl boat, but yes, I was there, and we rammed the dock or something like that, which was not intended. But we did go and get what we wanted, and we got back. And Steve had a bit of trouble with the engine, and but he was incredible the way he was able to get that thing going when it didn't always want to. Mm-hmm. But he got it going, and we got there and we got back.
And so now you're getting ready to get into the main part of the bay. The evening is beautiful. Everybody is up on deck looking at the stars, but you're just going very slowly. And Meckling tells us that he turned off the radio to keep quiet because people like the Sobels, who are an older couple, had put themselves into bed. So he misses the midnight update, which was very alarming, letting everyone know that Hurricane Connie was indeed tracking up the bay at this point. And you guys, unaware, turned in and you woke up. Well, one thing that's really interesting, I'd like to show you this, everyone. So John kept a diary on the ship, and this is why we know so much about what happened on this voyage that day. And everyone turned in. John got out his diary that evening, and started it with the wow, what a day! It was the best day. You had this really fun swimming, and then you went on the little adventure on the yawl boat, and when little did he know that the next morning when you woke up and went down, what did you encounter in the dining hall?
Well, in retrospect now, thinking about it and all of this discussion, it's amazing that Thursday was such a great day. It really was. And the next morning when we woke up, it was entirely different, entirely different. The weather was much different, and I think that it was somewhat alarming, really. As far as what Kathy just mentioned, when we were at breakfast, people were sitting, eating, and so on, and water started coming up through the deck, through the seams of the decking, actually coming up. And that was, not something that was supposed to happen.
And then Captain Meckling came into the dining room.
Yeah, I think that's when they started the pumps. They had a couple of pumps on board. Knowing now more or less more about what happened, I think that what was happening, the water was coming in forward, and as the water came in forward and the bow went down, that made things worse instead of better, or instead of being equal. So they were pumping forward, and then we had a little portable pump that we took aft after a while. And I think there was also a hand pump that was being used.
And the sails had to come down. And just to be clear, we can see the full rig here. And there was a small donkey engine on board that was used to turn a capstan to help raise those very heavy sails and lower them. Typically, Bill Verge, who's here today, and his friend Steve McDougall were the deckhands, and between the two of them, they could pretty much handle it. But this particular trip, Bill wasn't there because, believe it or not, he and Steve had hatched a plan to buy the Marvel. And so Bill was up proposing to a group of investors their plans for purchasing and refurbishing the Marvel to its former glory. So Steve was running that. He was being the deckhand. And when they got into the outer bands of the storm, when they were in the bay trying to make Annapolis, he was unable to handle when they needed to shorten the sail, and I think you lowered the sail, you had to get all the passengers up, right?
People were all wanted to do whatever they could to help the men, of course, to help the captain and Steve, so that there was no hesitation on anyone's part to do whatever the captain asked them to do, or needed them to do.
As you were crossing the bay, they were unable to, with having reduced the sail and lost a sail apparently, and it gets fuzzy exactly what was going on, but during the crossing you were unable to make Annapolis because that would have required a turn to the north into a northeast wind. Attempting to make West River, which would have given, they just couldn't do any maneuvering, which is why they wind up down here at Herring Bay. When you got here in Herring Bay, and actually pretty remarkable that Meckling could, in this wind and waves, navigate behind the shoal there, and dropped an anchor. Was there a sense of relief? Did you think, oh, okay, we're all good?
No, I don't think so. I think people were very much on edge because the weather was terrible. I mean, it was raining and very windy, and the bay was like the ocean as far as novices were concerned.
Right.
When he anchored, I've learned subsequently that perhaps he didn't put enough scope on the anchors, and that may have contributed greatly to the ship foundering. Mm-hmm. And we were still, water was coming in, and water was coming through the portholes People tried to close the ports, and the fastenings were missing on a lot of them, and they couldn't be closed. Or there was a sleeve that went from the outside of the vessel to the inside, a metal sleeve, and a lot of those were corroded. We tried to stuff blankets into those, but the blankets just fell down in between the outer and the inner skin of the ship. So, no, I don't think that anybody was exactly relieved at that point. No.
Uh-huh. So everybody is pretty much gathered in the deck house unless you were operating the pumps?
Well, I remember being just down the steps from the deck house into the little like main fore and aft corridor where we had the auxiliary pump, and someone, I think the captain said, I think we have to think now in terms of abandoning the ship because it just was overwhelming. So most of the people did come up into the deck house. Was a lounge that was at the aft end of the boat. The pictures don't really show it too well, but it was a pretty big, sizable square room. Mm-hmm. And people were there, and they were kind of like in the perimeter of the room, all around it. And just for no particular reason, Nancy Madden was right at the little ladder that went from the deck house up on deck. And then I think I was there, and my father, and then other people all around. Mm-hmm. And the captain said, we will put this, everyone had put life jackets on earlier in the day. I don't remember exactly when, but again, there was no hesitation to do that. Everyone went along with that. The captain said, we're going to pass a rope around to link everyone together. We'll put it between you and your life jacket. So they started that rope with Nancy, and it went through me and my father and on down all around. I don't know how far it got. Mm-hmm. Steve was up on deck, and he said, you better come on now. So I remember she went up ahead of me, and I remember when I went up, my father, I think, went ahead of me, and I went up and I turned around. The little companionway faced aft, of course. So when I got up to the top of those steps, I turned around and looked at the length of the Marvel, and she had rolled over on her side, and the masts were at an angle to the sea. And then suddenly I was in the water, and other people still had to come back up through that hatch and get out, and I don't know how they did.
How about you, Maggie? Can you give us your mother's recollection of that period when the escape occurred?
The way she described it, the captain had asked my father to do this passing of the rope and getting people's life jackets. Was it in front of your body? Yeah. So they were separated because he was doing this work, and she was nearer to John and nearer to a way out. And when this tilting happened, she had a sense of impending doom, she said to herself, one of us has got to survive. We have these two little kids, and she found a window. And John showed me on the model that's been built. Diane can say where that is, but there's a model at the Deal Museum, and John was able to show me the windows, one of the two windows my mother was likely to have gone out through, which was, an amazing experience for me to see it physically. But she said she had to get out. She got out. She was in the water, kind of holding hands and being with people for a while until they found the duck blind. And then she would describe that she got up into the duck blind and was rescued from there.
And John, you found a piece of flotsam, which was actually the roof to that same deck house, right?
Well, yeah, I was floating around. I had a life jacket, of course, floating around, and another life jacket came along, so I grabbed that. I had two of them on, and I saw a couple of people at different times. I saw Debbie once, and I saw the body of a person. And then the whole deck house, the whole top of that lounge came off the vessel intact in one piece. It was a great big thing. It must have been 16 feet square, I guess. And the hatch opening was in the roof of it. So I swam to get to that, and I got on it. I got washed off a couple of times. I was able to get back on. I saw Debbie once, and I said to her, swim for that thing, but then she disappeared. And I got back onto it a final time, and I realized that the sill across the hatch was still there. So I put my back on the back of the hatch and my feet on the sill, and I had the two sides of the hatch, so I was really perfectly safe. I was surrounded in a very firm spot, and I just stayed there and drifted in that, in the wind and the water. You couldn't see anything. My fear was, I had two fears: that it would get dark, or that I would go somewhere that I shouldn't. But fortunately, I stayed there until I felt that it wasn't moving anymore. So I put my foot down and I touched bottom. And you could see a little bit now and then, and I saw sort of a shoreline. It wasn't far at all. And I started walking there, and then somebody came down and grabbed me. And that's about all I really remember. I don't remember too much about what happened
But you were
after that.
adrift for probably
It was about 3 hours.
3 hours.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that? I mean, I find it funny in a way that you say, I knew I was perfectly safe. Like, that's not my definition
Relatively
of safe.
speaking.
Exactly. And so then you got to shore. And do you have any recollections of the sort of scene that Diane just set for us about what was going on? Did people give you blankets?
Well, where I came ashore was a line of houses, I think, that were built along the shoreline, and I believe it was bulkheaded. I didn't see too many people. Somebody took me into their house, and they gave me clothing. That's about all I remember. I think they did send me to a hospital. I think someone asked me if I had a relative on board, but I didn't see a lot of what Diane described. No, I didn't see that. I was kind of isolated from it.
So then you obviously learned that your dad didn't make it, and so did somebody call home?
Well, yeah, as I said, they asked me if I had a relative on board. I guess they found my father's identification with him, and somehow they reached my family, and one of my two sisters whose family had a summer house in Ocean City, Jersey, she and her husband came down and picked me up and took me home, back to Bloomfield.
And your parents, Maggie, your mother, did she go back to New Haven before your dad was recovered? How did that?
I think before she left the area, she had been told that his body was found and that there was quite a bruise on his head. So we always imagined that he was knocked unconscious and, never made it to the surface. And my mother's mother and her son-in-law, my uncle, came down and gathered her up and took her to my grandmother's house in West Hartford, Connecticut. And she never returned to New Haven. They had just moved into a little house on a cul-de-sac in a new development that summer. And so she must have sold it, and we stayed with our grandparents for about 6 months until she decided she wanted her own home and bought a house that we moved into.
And John, you you had to come back, finish high school, mourn the loss of your dad, and also repeatedly returned to testify both at the Coast Guard inquest, the grand jury, and the trial, kept reliving this.
I didn't, I wasn't at the trial. I was at the Coast Guard inquiry. And that was pretty quick after the accident.
I see.
Or incident. And, yeah, we went back and forth from Newark Penn Station to Baltimore Penn Station a number of times on the train. And that's where some of those pictures were taken, that awful one of me like that.
And then you graduated, and this is what I find interesting, and this will sort of be our closing note, is, you know, I think a lot of people here would imagine you moving out to Midwest, like Kansas, someplace as far away from the sea as you could. And instead, you tell us what you did.
Well, I graduated from high school on a Friday, and the following Wednesday I started as an office boy at the Cunard Line.
And he spent his career on the Cunard Line. And just as a local closing note, I'd like to ask you to share your recollection, because I'm sure a lot of people here remember Vera's White Sands and what a character she was, and just listen to this coincidence. John, could you share that?
I met Vera. She was a Cunard passenger. She did a world cruise. She did some crossings, and she did some other short cruises. And I met her. The first time I met her was when she came into our office on 42nd Street, and she had her major domo with her then, George, I think his name was. He drove her, she had a Bentley, and he drove her car for her up from Maryland to New York, and he was at the restaurant. And then I was on one crossing with her, and she was unique. She was a wonderful woman who certainly enjoyed life, and she wanted everyone around her to enjoy it too, and she did that.
And that was the lesson, really, I took from your diary, which was returned to you by the Maryland State Police. You received a package in the mail.
That was incredible. One of the state policemen found it drifting in the water, and it was still intact. And, well, it had a little gash in it, but he put it in an envelope and mailed it back to me. And of course, I have it.
And John has a fantastic archive of all of these things and a fantastic memory. And I want to thank you for sharing all of this with us. And Maggie, thank you for bringing to life, really, I think, this tragedy for people.